the foundation of mind. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy, while occupying only 2% of its mass, suggesting that consciousness was an expensive evolutionary investment. That paradox frames the question: why would natural selection pay such a metabolic price for subjective experience? The answer lies in predictive leverage. Small organisms reacted. Humans began to simulate. Instead of only responding to immediate stimuli, early hominins could rehearse scenarios, plan tools, and imagine outcomes before risking life or limb. Contextually, this shift involved three intertwined changes. First, social complexity made simple reflexes insufficient. Second, language created symbolic scaffolding to store and share abstract models. Third, a brain capable of internal simulation amplified learning without fatal trial and error. Together, these changes turned cognition into an engine for foresight. Consider a hunter who can picture a stalking path and a weather pattern before leaving camp. That mental simulation reduces risk and multiplies success. Neuroscience supports this with evidence of the default mode network and predictive coding mechanisms that run simulations during rest and sleep. Anthropology shows increasingly intricate tool use and cooperative hunting as these capacities emerge. Philosophically, the emergence of imagination reframes agency. Minds now manipulate worlds as well. This evolutionary spark has consequences for modern life. It explains why humans suffer from imagined threats as much as real ones, why storytelling organizes social truth, and why planning feels rewarding. It also implies a mental model for action. Treat imagined scenarios as training grounds, not verdicts. Practice constructing multiple plausible futures. Test them against feedback. And privilege models that conserve energy and reduce surprise. Use this lens to build clearer habits and choices. In short, consciousness was selected not for raw awareness, but for enhanced prediction. Its value is measured not by experience alone, but by the accuracy and economy of the simulations it produces. From instinct to intellect. The first human thought is neither pure instinct nor pure reason. It is a rapid hypothesis born of survival routines and repeated practice. From biology's side, we inherit fast response systems, reflexes, conditioned patterns that handle immediate threats. From culture's side, we inherit symbols and rules that slow the brain down, enabling planning and abstraction. The mind's work of formation stitches these layers together. Stage 1. Embodied routines. Newborns learn by moving and sensing. Sensor-motor loops create reliable expectations. Stage 2. Symbolic framing. Words, labels, and social categories let the mind compress experience into reusable concepts. Stage 3. Integrative reflection. With practice and feedback, procedural habits and symbolic narratives synchronize, producing deliberate choices that feel intellectual. Empirical findings back this architecture. Developmental studies link early motor skill and imitation with later problem solving. Neuroimaging separates rapid subcortical loops for emotion and habit from slower cortical networks for simulation and planning, yet shows constant interaction between them. Everyday examples make the idea concrete. A startled cyclist applies an automatic brake, then evaluates the cause and plans a safer route. A novice cook repeats a routine until timing becomes embodied, then adapts recipes with conceptual understanding. There is a revealing paradox. The mind's highest feats, counterfactual thinking, long-term planning, depend on the fidelity of lower-level instincts. Without consistent, embodied routines, abstract models, have unstable inputs. The intellect refines and repurposes what instinct provides. For change, the practical method follows the architecture. Align repeated practice with clarifying language. Build habits that generate reliable data. Name patterns to make them thinkable. Use reflection to link action and meaning. Training that mixes doing and describing accelerates development. In brief, intellect grows out of instinct through layered additions, symbolic tools and reflective practices that reorganize automatic responses into coherent deliberative thought. This process is gradual, empirical, and amenable to deliberate shaping. The social brain hypothesis. The clearest evidence for the social brain hypothesis is simple. Primates with more complex social lives have larger neocortices than solitary species. Human minds evolved not just to solve physical problems, but to manage relationships, tracking alliances, intentions, reputations, and obligations. Social living imposes cognitive demands. Predict another's reaction, remember favors, infer hidden motives. Over evolutionary time, these demands favored brains capable of representing others' minds. Start with context. Comparative biology links group size and cortical volume. Anthropology shows cultural complexity rises with denser social networks. Neuroscience locates theory of mind and social valuation in specialized circuits that interact with memory and executive systems. Together, these strands argue that intelligence expanded as a tool for social coordination, not only for tool-making. Follow 3 mechanisms. First, mentalizing. Simulating another's perspective reduces costly errors in cooperation. Second, reputational bookkeeping. Remembering who cooperated and who cheated organizes reciprocal systems at scale. Third, cultural niche construction. Learned rules and institutions scaffold social cognition, so individuals can navigate larger groups than raw biology would permit. Concrete example: gossip functions like group-level memory, spreading reputational data faster than direct experience. Rituals and norms act like compression algorithms. They summarize complex histories into simple cues that guide behavior. In modern life, social cognition shapes reasoning. Career moves, political persuasion, consumer choices rely on inferred minds. Attention emerges. Social brains amplify both cooperation and manipulation. Skills that promote group cohesion can be repurposed for deception. This contradiction explains why large societies develop checks, norms, laws, institutions that stabilize trust when individual motives clash. Practical takeaway: strengthen social cognition by practicing perspective taking, recording interactions, and building predictable norms in groups. The social brain hypothesis reframes intelligence as a social instrument. Our thinking evolved to hold other minds and to make complex cooperation possible at scale in everyday life. Consciousness likely began as an internal reporter that compresses ongoing sensation into short narratives useful for prediction and social transmission. Biologically, early brains solved immediate survival problems with reflexes and simple learning. The birth of consciousness required a new capacity: integration across time. Neural circuits that maintain brief representations, working memory, and episodic traces allowed organisms to hold a stitched sequence of events long enough to test hypotheses about what happens next. Evolution favored organisms whose internal reports reliably predicted outcomes and could be shared or acted upon by others. 3 interacting mechanisms explain the emergence. First, temporal binding. Sensory streams from different modalities are synchronized into unitary moments, producing coherent frames of experience. Second, predictive simulation. Internal models run short trajectories that forecast consequences, converting perception into expectation. Third, narrative compression. The brain reduces rich experience into compact stories or labels, making information portable for planning and social exchange. Empirical signs support this architecture. Infants develop anticipatory gaze before full self-recognition, indicating prediction precedes explicit self-modeling. Patients with blind sight process stimuli without conscious report, separating prediction and integration from verbal access. Neuroimaging links frontoparietal networks with broadcasting integrated states, while hippocampal systems supply temporal context. A useful paradox. Consciousness feels continuous, but is built from discrete operations, binding, simulating, summarizing, that run in sequence. Practically, strengthening attention, deliberate reflection, and sleep-dependent memory consolidation enhances the fidelity of the internal reporter. Techniques that stabilize routine input and encourage narrative labeling, journaling, interleaved practice, structured rest, improve clarity of conscious experience. Words act like levers. A single label can lift a messy cluster of sensations into a stable concept you can inspect and move. Language supplies tools for abstraction. Biologically, humans evolved vocal control and social learning that let sounds map reliably onto meanings. Developmentally, children use words to carve categories and rehearse actions internally. Neurally, language regions interact with memory and executive systems to hold variables in mind. 4 mechanisms carry the work. First, labeling compresses data. Names reduce variation and let you operate on the essence rather than every instance. Second, recursion lets thoughts nest, clauses within clauses, so the mind can represent relations and rules, not merely objects. Third, metaphor transfers structure from a familiar domain to a novel one, permitting reasoning by analogy. Fourth, inner speech converts public language into a private workspace for planning and reflection. Research provides concrete signs. Number words change how children learn counting and arithmetic. Cross-linguistic studies show color and spatial categories shift with linguistic labels. Imaging and developmental psychology link verbal rehearsal with frontal systems that support manipulation of abstract variables. Consider a practical case: learning probability. Naming outcomes and articulating conditional steps lets novices simulate alternatives mentally. Without labels, possibilities remain an inchoate blur. With precise terms, you can recombine elements and test scenarios. A paradox emerges. Language extends what we can think about while smoothing over detail. Labels create manipulable units but can hide edge cases. To sharpen abstract thought, alternate naming with unpacking. Give a concept a clear label, then practice reversing it to reveal nuance. In short, language is both tool and constraint. It constructs the spaces where abstract thought can run, build vocabulary, practice explanation, and use analogy to expand those spaces. Then, deliberately unpack labels to keep concepts flexible and accurate. The brain arranges complexity into layers, not a single command center, but a federated architecture that balances speed, flexibility, memory, and resilience. Start with context. Brains evolved under trade-offs. Some circuits must react in milliseconds. Others deliberate across seconds, minutes, or years. This temporal and functional layering produces distinct modules, sensory processors, action selectors, value evaluators, and integrative controllers that interact continuously. A revealing insight: Robustness arises from redundancy and specialization working together. Multiple systems often solve similar problems in parallel. When one fails, another can compensate, but specialization lets the whole system run efficiently. Neuroanatomy shows this. Sensory cortices map inputs with fine resolution, basal ganglia automate repeated actions, and prefrontal networks coordinate novel plans. 3 architectural principles guide function. First, hierarchy. Low-level routines operate beneath higher-level planners, providing stable primitives for complex behavior. Second, modularity with rich connectivity. Modules perform focused computations, but exchange summaries and predictions, allowing flexibility without chaos. Third, predictive coding. Cortex activity anticipates input, minimizing surprise and focusing processing on informative errors. Concrete examples help. When learning to drive, sensory motor loops automate pedal and steering, while prefrontal systems monitor traffic and adjust plans. In language, auditory and motor circuits pass and produce sounds while semantic networks integrate meaning. Damage studies and developmental disorders show how altering one node reshapes overall behavior, demonstrating both vulnerability and adaptability. Practical implication. To improve cognition, train automated routines and integrative skills. Repetition strengthens reliable primitives. Varied practice and reflection enhance cross-module coordination. Sleep and spaced rehearsal consolidate hierarchies into stable patterns. In sum, the brain's architecture is a cooperative patchwork. Layered, modular, and predictive. This organization trades raw speed for flexible intelligence, letting organisms respond instantly when needed and to plan when time permits. Understanding these principles clarifies how learning, habit, and creativity emerge from the same physical scaffold and resilience. More often than we realize, choice is assembled below awareness. Brain signals predicting a decision can appear before we report deciding, showing the subconscious as the engine of action. The subconscious is not a mysterious ghost, but a vast, efficient processing layer shaped by evolution and learning. It specializes in recognizing patterns, executing routines, and assigning quick value to options, so conscious attention can focus on exceptions. Evolution favored fast, low-cost solutions, habits that save time, heuristics that reduce information load, and effective tags that bias choices without deliberation. 4 core mechanisms explain its power. Pattern detection compresses experience into templates, faces, roots, tonal cues that allow immediate recognition. Automation stores repeated sequences in basal ganglia and cerebellar circuits, freeing cortex for novel problems. Valuation tags options with emotional weight, gut-level preferences that guide approach or avoidance. Prediction runs short simulations that anticipate likely outcomes, letting the system preemptively act. Empirical examples make this concrete. A driver brakes reflexively at a child's sudden movement. A seasoned negotiator senses a lie before conscious doubt emerges. Priming experiments shift choice probabilities without explicit awareness. Clinical evidence, habit disorders, implicit bias studies, and procedural amnesia shows the subconscious can drive behavior independently of conscious recall. A practical paradox follows. The subconscious is both reliable and opaque. Its efficiencies enable complex life, but its shortcuts produce bias. To harness it, shape input and repetition. Design environments that feed useful patterns. Practice desired behaviors until they automatize. Label routines so they become retrievable. And use sleep and spaced rehearsal to to consolidate changes. Small, repeated changes rearrange the engine more effectively than one-off rational decisions. Perception and constructed reality. What you see is not a photograph of the world, but a running hypothesis. Your brain continually edits to make action possible. Perception selects and simplifies. Sensory organs supply noisy, partial data. The brain's task is to sample that stream and infer what matters for behavior. Evolution favored systems that favor utility over exactness, representations that guide timely action, not exhaustive accuracy. This produces a built reality shaped by prior expectations, focus, and recent experience. 4 mechanisms create constructed perception. First, sampling. The eyes and ears pick a few informative slices of the scene rather than everything, so gaze and attention determine much of what becomes visible. Second, prediction. Cortical circuits generate expectations and fill gaps, making stable objects out of ambiguous inputs. Third, attentional selection amplifies some signals and suppresses others, tuning perception to current goals. Fourth, memory and language supply templates that label and stabilize fleeting impressions into coherent categories. Concrete evidence supports this view. Optical illusions reveal predictable mismatches between input and experience. Cross-cultural studies show language shapes color and spatial perception. Change blindness experiments demonstrate how much of a scene can be ignored without notice. Clinically, hallucinations and confabulations illustrate what happens when priors dominate input. A practical tension follows. Constructed perception is efficient but fallible. To reduce systematic error, adjust sampling and priors. Slow down to widen attention. Seek disconfirming evidence and vary contexts to update expectations. Simple practices. Explicitly naming observations, comparing multiple perspectives, and delaying judgment, expose hidden assumptions, and improve accuracy. In short, perception is an active, hypothesis-driven process. By controlling what we sample and by testing our expectations, we can make our constructed reality more reliable without losing the speed that makes perception useful. Memory as reconstruction. Remembering is editing. Every recall rewrites details, so memory is as much a tool as a record. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. The brain stores fragments, sensory traces, emotional tones, contextual cues, and later assembles them into a coherent account. This process favors usefulness. Memories that support decision-making and social identity are preserved, even if accuracy suffers. 3 linked processes explain reconstruction. Encoding filters experienced by attention and affect, privileging some inputs. Consolidation during rest and sleep integrates new traces with existing knowledge, strengthening some associations while discarding others. Retrieval is generative. Cues trigger partial reinstatement, and the hippocampus reconstructs scenes with aid from semantic knowledge and current goals. Empirical findings make consequences visible. Eyewitness research shows how post-event information and questioning introduce false details. Rehearsal can cement inaccuracies until they feel certain. Clinical dissociations, cases where patients retain facts but lack episodic imagery, demonstrate that different memory systems supply different building blocks for reconstruction. A revealing paradox emerges: flexibility enables adaptability, yet invites distortion. Memory's constructive nature helps generalize from past experience, but also permits bias. Practically, improving reliability focuses on both encoding and retrieval. Attend closely during important moments, reduce suggestive influences afterward, and use specific cues when recalling. External aids anchor reconstruction. Notes, timestamps, and photographs limit the brain's freedom to invent. Over time, repeated verification and diverse perspectives reduce error and build a more dependable communal account of past events and memory. In daily life, accept that memory is interpretive. Treat recollection as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a definitive archive. When disagreements arise, cross-check sources, value consistency over confidence, and use documentation to ground collective narratives. Small habits, focused attention, careful recording, and deliberate review shift reconstruction toward greater fidelity without erasing the adaptive flexibility that memory provides. The brain as a prediction machine. The brain treats surprise like a tax. Reducing it saves energy, but the effort to avoid surprise can also blind us to useful novelty. Prediction sits at the heart of perception and action. Rather than passively recording sensory input, neural systems generate forward models that forecast incoming signals. Incoming data arrive as feedback evaluating those forecasts. Evolution favored prediction because anticipating outcomes is cheaper and faster than reacting afresh each moment. 3 mechanisms make this work. First, hierarchical generative models. Lower layers predict raw sensations, while higher layers predict patterns and causes, so the brain composes complex expectations from simple priors. Second, precision weighting. The brain assigns confidence to predictions and to sensory data, tuning how much each prediction error should update beliefs. Third, prediction error signaling. Mismatches drive learning and attention, reallocating resources where models fail. Empirical evidence is robust. Mismatch negativity in EEG shows early sensory systems flag deviations automatically. Motor control uses forward models to correct movement before feedback arrives. In everyday life, music feels satisfying when it balances expectation and surprise. Too predictable is boring. Too surprising is confusing. A revealing contradiction follows. Minimizing surprise stabilizes behavior, but can reduce openness to learning. If priors are overweighted, errors are ignored, and bias persists. Practical takeaway. Optimal learning exposes the brain to manageable prediction errors. To teach or change habits, create situations where expectations are violated just enough to trigger update without causing overwhelm. Strategies include interleaved practice, variable contexts, and explicit forecasting. Ask learners to predict outcomes before performing a task. For perception, slow down and compare expectations with raw observations to detect hidden biases. The psychology of mind. Behavior and conditioning. The most reliable route to new behavior is not argument, but consequence. Immediate outcomes shape actions faster than beliefs. Conditioning is the brain's practical economy for linking deeds to results. Classical conditioning pairs cues with outcomes so neutral, signals trigger responses. Operant conditioning links voluntary actions to rewards or punishments, shaping the probability of future acts. Evolution equipped animals with systems, dopamine-mediated reinforcement, and habit circuits in the basal ganglia that favor strategies that reliably produced benefit in the past. 3 principles explain how behavior changes. First, contingency. Actions shift when consequences consistently follow them. Second, schedule sensitivity. Continuous reinforcement yields fast learning but fragile habits. Intermittent schedules create persistence. Third, discriminative control. Contextual cues indicate when particular behaviors will pay off, focusing responses into useful situations. Concrete examples clarify mechanics. A manager who acknowledges punctuality every day sees rapid improvement. If praise becomes unpredictable, punctuality persists longer. Smartphone apps exploit variable rewards and salient cues to entrench checking. Therapy uses habit reversal to insert incompatible actions and new contingencies. Addiction shows how potent rewards can hijack learning systems and narrow choice. A revealing contradiction follows. Conditioning enables efficient adaptation, yet hardens behavior. Habits free attention, but resist deliberate change. Lasting modification therefore uses two tactics: redesign immediate consequences to change momentum, and adjust discriminative cues and reinforcement schedules to shift control into automatic routines. Simple methods follow. Make desired actions reliably rewarding early, fade to intermittent reinforcement, remove cues for unwanted acts, and create prominent cues for alternatives. Over weeks, repeated contingencies rewrite the landscape of choices so that behavior changes before belief does. Small, consistent environmental edits produce outsized long-term shifts in everyday conduct reliably. Motivation and desire. A precise fact. Neural signals linked to motivation, especially dopamine-driven value estimates, often predict how much effort a person will expend long before they report an intention to act. Motivation is an on-the-spot computation that trades expected benefit against immediate cost. Evolution created systems that estimate worth. How rewarding is this? Estimate cost, how much effort or risk, and then allocate energy. These calculations happen fast, often below conscious awareness, and they integrate external incentives, recent experience, and a person's sense of self. Start with valuation. The brain tags options with expected utility. Outcomes that were reliably rewarding get stronger signals. Next, attention and salience bias, which options enter the decision frame. What you notice becomes a candidate for action. Third, effort allocation. The basal ganglia and frontostriatal loops weigh whether the expected reward justifies the work. Finally, identity and narrative modulate all three. Goals tied to who you are reduce perceived cost and raise sustained motivation. Empirical examples clarify the architecture. Laboratory tasks show participants will expend more force or time for higher predicted reward. Field studies show identity-based prompts, e.g., I am. A runner increased gym attendance more than abstract incentives. A paradox follows. Small shifts in perceived cost or identity often produce larger behavioral changes than large changes in stated goals. Practical implication. Raise perceived value and lower friction simultaneously. Make rewards immediate and meaningful. Reduce effortful barriers and anchor actions to identity. Techniques. Pair new habits with rewarding cues. Pre-commit to reduce choice friction, and label actions as consistent with your self-concept. Over weeks, these micro-optimizations reshape the local cost-benefit landscape, so motivation follows automatically. Emotion as information. The body signals more reliably than our arguments. Measurable physiological changes precede conscious reports, showing emotion as early data rather than mere feeling. Emotions are informational gradients that compress complex situations into actionable signals. Evolution shaped effective responses to tag opportunities and threats, prioritize attention, and bias learning. Rather than noise, emotions guide which facts matter now. 3 functions make emotions useful. First, prioritization. A sudden alarm narrows attention toward immediate threats. Contentment broadens exploration and learning. Second, valuation. Affect assigns quick weights to options: comfort, disgust, curiosity. so choices need not await slow deliberation. Third, learning modulation. Emotional salience enhances memory consolidation, ensuring consequential events shape future expectations. Empirical observations illustrate the architecture. Autonomic changes, heart rate, skin conductance often precede reported fear, indicating that the body's early signal informs the mind. Effective forecasting research shows people mispredict future feelings, revealing how current emotion is a proximal cue, not a perfect predictor. Clinical conditions like alexithymia, where people struggle to identify feelings, impair decision-making, supporting the role of emotion as usable information. A paradox emerges. Emotions both clarify and confound. They reduce complexity by highlighting what matters, yet they can bias judgment when signals reflect transient states or misattributed causes. Practical strategies follow directly. First, treat emotions as data by labeling them. Naming reduces noise and increases granularity. Second, check for source and timescale. Ask whether the feeling arises from the present situation or from unrelated stress. Third, sample before acting. Delay brief moments to. In daily life, use emotion as a quick filter. Trust it to prioritize, not to finalize. Combine affective cues with simple verification. Label, localize, and delay. Doing so preserves the adaptive speed of emotions while reducing systematic error in judgment. Also, invite others' perspectives when signals feel unclear, and document recurrent patterns. Personality and temperament. Identical twins raised apart often resemble one another in temperament, reactivity, sociability, and baseline emotional style, showing that biological bias reliably shapes life tendencies. Temperament appears early, influenced by genetics, prenatal factors, and initial neural wiring. Personality develops over years as those predispositions interact with experience, culture, and the stories people tell about themselves. The result is a patterned set of tendencies that predict behavior without dictating every act. Three linked processes explain persistence and flexibility. First, evocative feedback. Innate dispositions change how others respond, and those responses reinforce the original tendencies. Second, niche selection. People seek environments that match their dispositions, which amplifies trait expression. Third, self-construction. Repeated actions are woven into identity through narrative, turning behavior into stable personality. Empirical touchpoints make this concrete. Researchers use surveys, behavioral observation, and physiological markers to map temperament and its developmental pathways. Applied programs, coaching, habit design, and social scaffolding produce measurable shifts across months. Longitudinal studies show moderate rank order stability of traits across decades. Intervention research finds that sustained practice and context shifts can alter trait-relevant behaviors, even if baseline temperament remains. Everyday observation shows a naturally persistent person can learn strategic effort allocation. A highly reactive person can acquire regulation skills that change outward expression. A revealing paradox follows. Stability and change coexist. Temperament constrains probability distributions of behavior, but does not write fixed scripts. Practically, change is ecological and incremental. Adjust environments. Create repeated practices that build new automatic responses, and rewrite self-narratives to support different habits. Small contextual edits, new routines, social scaffolds, targeted feedback shift trajectories more reliably than exhortation alone. Acknowledging temperament explains tendency without excusing it, and provides a practical roadmap for development over time and effort. The formation of self. People change who they are not primarily by rehearsing the past, but by repeatedly inhabiting small, believable futures. The formation of self is a process of projection as much as recollection. From a biological baseline, temperament and neural predispositions, humans layer social scripts and imagine trajectories that organize action. Children learn labels and roles. Adolescents try on possible selves. Adults prune those options by practice and feedback. What solidifies into me is often the future we habitually simulate and the reactions those simulations elicit from others. 3 mechanisms explain this forward-facing architecture. First, prospection, the capacity to simulate plausible future supplies, target states the organism can move toward. Vivid imagined outcomes guide attention, select goals, and bias memory toward task-relevant evidence. Second, social calibration. Others respond to projected behavior. Their recognition and correction either reinforce a nascent self or prune it away. Third, embodied repetition. Repeated acts, small rituals, routines, roles, convert imagined scenarios into automatic patterns that feel like stable traits. Empirical patterns support the primacy of future-directed shaping. Goal-setting studies show that visualizing attainable identities increases subsequent behavior change more than ruminating on past mistakes. Narrative therapy leverages future self-images to rewire habits and social roles. Everyday examples are practical. Someone who mentally rehearses "I am a morning person" and arranges social check-ins will, over weeks, align actions with that identity more reliably than someone who merely remembers nights they stayed up late. A revealing paradox follows. The self feels like history, but is often a plan in action. Stability arises because we continuously practice a small set of anticipated behaviors in social contexts that confirm them. To change identity, design believable futures, secure predictable social responses, and repeat small behaviors until they automate. These steps reorient the mind from archiving who you were to actively shaping who you will be. Cognitive biases and heuristics. Simple heuristics often outperform slow deliberation in routine environments because they are compressed rules tuned to regularities, not flaws in reasoning. Biases and heuristics are adaptation, not accident. The mind reduces high-dimensional problems into salient cues and compact rules so decisions are fast and metabolically cheap. Evolution and learning calibrate these shortcuts to typical contexts. When environments differ, the shortcuts produce systematic errors rather than random noise. 3 mechanisms explain predictable failures. First, representational compression. The brain encodes summaries and salient features, so judgments operate on reduced inputs. Second, availability and anchoring. Ease of recall and initial reference points bias estimation, because retrieval and adjustment are less costly than recomputation. Third, framing and model activation. How a problem is described selects mental models and thus the heuristic applied, shaping outcomes independently of base facts. Empirical examples clarify the pattern. The availability heuristic makes dramatic but rare events feel common after exposure. Anchoring shifts negotiation outcomes toward initial offers. Framing changes risk preferences when identical information is cast as loss or gain. Lab and field studies repeatedly show structured, directional biases that are predictable and replicable. A revealing paradox follows. Heuristics produce competent behavior in familiar settings, yet demand correction in statistical or novel domains. Practical steps therefore split. Design environments so heuristics point toward desired actions. Use salient defaults, immediate feedback, and clear cues. And, when accuracy matters, externalize computation. Consult base rates, use checklists, elicit counterexamples, and slow down to recompute. These measures preserve speed where useful and inject accuracy where necessary. In short, cognitive shortcuts are useful tools with identifiable failure modes. Managing them is a matter of context design and deliberate procedures that supplement innate heuristics. The balance of logic and emotion. Emotion and logic operate as distinct but interdependent systems. Emotion assigns immediate value while logic provides enduring constraints, and functional choices emerge when both align. Evolution favored effective signals to flag relevance and cortical processes to model futures. Emotion orients attention and assigns urgency. Logic constructs rules and evaluates consequences. Their interaction is an arbitration that balances short-term priority with long-term coherence. 3 mechanisms clarify the balance. Valuation. Affective responses tag options with weight and immediacy, producing a priority map for cognition. Representation. Logical systems build abstract models and simple rules that generalize across contexts. Arbitration. Executive networks compare emotional salience with rule-based limits, adjusting thresholds for action or delay. Empirical patterns support this architecture. Patients lacking normal emotional signaling can deliberate yet fail to commit. Frontal damage preserves desire but impairs planning. Laboratory studies show framing and mood shift risk choices, even when facts are unchanged. Everyday cases are direct. Startling alarm prompts instant rescue. Subsequent reflection creates routines or policies to prevent repetition. A revealing paradox follows. Emotion supplies purpose and momentum, yet can bias judgment. Logic enforces consistency, yet can feel empty without value. The practical method is integration. Name the feeling to acknowledge priority, state a clear rule to bound options, and select the action that satisfies both urgency and constraint. For instance, if frustration urges immediate correction, pause to label the feeling, decide a non-escalatory rule, and choose the least harmful corrective step. Over weeks and months, pairing explicit labeling with simple rules shifts default thresholds so automatic responses respect long-term aims. This approach preserves the speed of affect while using logic to prevent repeated mistakes, making everyday choices both meaningful and dependable. Practice consistently for measurable change over time. Learning and adaptation. Learning is less about accumulating facts and more about tuning internal models so they predict outcomes. The better the model, the fewer surprises you pay for. Organisms face changing environments. Adaptation matches behavior to those changes. Evolution supplies plasticity and basic learning algorithms. Experience provides data. The mind learns by detecting patterns, updating expectations, and reallocating resources towards successful strategies. 3 mechanisms drive effective adaptation. First, error-driven updating. Prediction errors flag mismatches and trigger model revision. Neuroscience links dopamine signals with such updates, reinforcing actions that yield positive outcomes. Second, transfer and abstraction. The mind extracts structure so lessons generalize across contexts, turning situational successes into portable rules. Third, meta-learning. Systems learn how to learn, adjusting learning rates, exploration strategies, and attention. Concrete examples clarify this architecture. A rookie driver internalizes control dynamics via repeated correction. When conditions change, adaptive drivers quickly reweight cues. In education, interleaving varied problems produces robust skill transfer more than blocked practice. Organizations that run small experiments and update policies from measured outcomes adapt faster than those relying on static plans. A revealing paradox emerges. Stability supports learning, yet too much stability prevents adaptation. Predictable environments let models converge. Volatile environments demand flexible exploration. Practical implication: structure learning with controllable variability. Provide clear feedback, introduce moderate novelty to trigger useful updates, and practice abstraction by comparing instances. For deliberate change, use 3 tactics. Make goals specific and measurable so prediction errors are informative, vary contexts to encourage transfer, and reflect on strategies to adjust learning parameters. Sleep, spaced practice, and immediate corrective feedback accelerate consolidation. In short, learning and adaptation are active calibration processes. Notice errors, abstract patterns, and tune how you learn. Designing environments that deliver informative surprises and practice converts experience into reliable, adaptable skill. Over time, iterative updates compound into durable competence. The mirror of society. A person's attitudes and choices are often predicted more accurately by their close network than by their age or income. Society provides the mirror in which minds learn their contours. From infancy, we absorb norms, labels, and plausible reasoning patterns by sampling peers, caretakers, and institutions. Over time, those inputs become heuristics, social shortcuts that economize cognition but also propagate biases. 4 mechanisms explain how networks shape minds. First, social sampling. We estimate probabilities from the people we encounter, so local homogeneity yields strong consensus. Second, normative reinforcement. Repeated approval or sanction turns behaviors into internal norms. Third, identity signaling. Adopting beliefs shows group membership, which secures cooperation and resources. Fourth, institutional compression. Routines, rituals, and media compress complex cultural histories into simple cues that guide everyday action. Concrete examples clarify. Echo chambers amplify rare views into perceived majorities. Workplace cultures set implicit standards. What counts as professional, punctual, or ambitious? Political polarization arises when intergroup contact falls and selective exposure rises. Positive cases are equally social. Public health campaigns leverage norms and visible compliance to shift behavior at scale. A revealing paradox follows. Minds both reflect and remake society. Shared environments canalize thought, yet coordinated actions by individuals can reorganize those very environments. Small coordinated behaviors, new norms, repeated practices, transparent institutions cascade into large cultural shifts. Practical implication: to change thinking, change social inputs, diversify your networks, practice norms that reward critical thinking, and create institutional cues that make desired behaviors visible and repeatable. When evaluating strong beliefs, sample outside your immediate circle, test assumptions against base rates, and privilege disconfirming evidence. In short, the social mirror shapes cognition by selecting samples, enforcing norms, signaling identity, and compressing culture into cues. Steering collective minds requires modest, sustained changes to those social mirrors. Different reflections yield different selves over time. The mind-body connection. The mind-body connection is a continuous loop. Sensory organs inform the brain, but internal bodily signals, interoception, also inform cognition. Evolution equipped organisms to read internal states because hunger, arousal, and fatigue reliably predict what actions will succeed. Modern neuroscience shows these signals reach the insular, limbic, and prefrontal circuits, where they bias attention, memory, and choice. 4 mechanisms explain how bodily states steer the mind. First, interoceptive signaling. Sensations from the viscera provide a running estimate of energy and safety that colors perception. Second, neurochemical modulation. Hormones and neuromodulators like cortisol, adrenaline, and dopamine change learning rates and risk tolerance. Third, sensoromotor loops. Actions alter environment and internal feedback, creating learning contingencies that embed habits. Fourth, embodied rehearsal. Repeating physical routines converts goals into automatic responses that reduce cognitive load. Concrete examples make this practical. A short walk recalibrates stress hormones and improves problem solving. Postural adjustment before a presentation reduces anxiety reports and improves clarity. Sleep-dependent consolidation links daytime bodily rhythms to memory strength. Clinical cases, chronic pain or sleep deprivation, show how persistent bodily perturbations reshape attention and mood over months. A revealing contradiction emerges. The same mechanisms that make the body a useful informant also introduce bias. Acute arousal sharpens focus but narrows reasoning. Chronic stress reallocates resources away from long-term planning. To harness the link, shape reliable inputs, regulate sleep, design simple movement breaks, practice breath-based resets, and scaffold new routines with clear cues. In short, the brain reads the body to decide what matters. Small, repeated bodily practices change the signals the brain trusts, and over time, those altered signals reconfigure thought, habit, and identity. The limits of mind. Overthinking and rumination. Overthinking feels like gathering information, but it often functions as rehearsal for fear. The more we loop possibilities in our heads, the less able we are to test them in the world. Rumination is repetitive, often negative, thinking that replays past events or endlessly spins future what-ifs. Unlike planning, which generates testable steps, rumination cycles through scenarios without committing to action. Cognitive science shows this pattern taxes working memory, biases recall toward negative evidence, and amplifies emotional arousal, creating a self-sustaining loop that looks productive but narrows options. 4 mechanisms explain why loops persist. First, attentional capture. Intrusive thoughts repeatedly draw cognitive resources away from task-relevant processing. Second, memory bias. Selective recall supplies fodder that confirms worry, making problems seem larger. Third, affect amplification. Sustained focus on threats elevates anxiety, which further impairs cognitive control. Fourth, action inhibition. Rumination substitutes simulation for experimentation, delaying feedback that would resolve uncertainty. Everyday examples are familiar. Replaying a social slip without reaching out to repair it, or endlessly revising an email instead of sending it. Empirical work links rumination to poorer problem solving and longer recovery from setbacks. The paradox is clear. The mental effort spent seems like control, but it actually preserves uncertainty by preventing decisive tests. Practical steps follow a simple logic: reduce uninformative rehearsal and increase fast feedback. Time box worrying, limit to 10 minutes. Externalize the loop. Write the core concern and one testable action. Run a brief behavioral experiment. then record the result. Use environmental cues to trigger action. Set an send alarm. Practice labeling thoughts to reduce reactivity, and employ physical resets, short walks or breathing, to break escalation. Over weeks, these small interventions shift the brain from looping to sampling, replacing imagined rehearsal with concrete evidence. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance appears when actions, beliefs, or self-conceptions clash. The uncomfortable gap creates a motivational force. Resolve the inconsistency by changing beliefs, altering future behavior, or reframing the past. Evolutionarily, stable self-narratives reduce social friction and speed decisions. Psychologically, dissonance reduction conserves cognitive resources and preserves predictable identity. 3 mechanisms explain the dynamics. First, inconsistency detection. Prefrontal monitoring flags mismatches between expectation and action, generating aversive signals. Second, motivated inference. The mind selectively retrieves and weights evidence that supports favored narratives, an availability and confirmation process that tends to minimize felt conflict. Third, action or narrative revision. People either adjust behavior to fit beliefs, reinterpret events to fit the self, or adopt compensatory beliefs that restore coherence. Empirical examples make this concrete. Effort justification shows how people value outcomes more if they worked hard for them. Post-choice spreading of alternatives increases liking for chosen items and diminishes appeal of rejected ones. Moral licensing demonstrates how a prior virtuous act reduces subsequent restraint, resolving dissonance between self-image and temptation. Studies using choice paradigms and neuroimaging reveal both behavioral shifts and reduced conflict signals following rationalization. A revealing paradox follows. The mechanisms that protect self-coherence also bias judgment and block learning. Practically, reduce harmful dissonance by creating structures that expose contradictions safely, solicit external feedback, pre-commit to testable criteria, document decisions and reasons before outcomes, and adopt a habit of generating specific, falsifiable hypotheses rather than vague defenses. When you catch rationalization, ask for one concrete action that would falsify your preferred narrative. If none exists, treat the belief as provisional. The illusion of control. People prefer doing something over doing nothing even when outcomes are random. The urge to act creates the illusion of control, and that illusion often prevents us from learning how the world actually works. The illusion of control arises from adaptive heuristics. Humans evolved to detect contingencies. Linking actions to outcomes was survival critical. Those systems, however, are biased. We overestimate our influence when events are frequent, when we choose actions, or when outcomes follow close in time. Cognitive drivers include pattern seeking, finding structure where none exists, contingency misattribution, crediting action for coincidental success, action bias, preferring to act to reduce uncertainty, and avoidance of corrective feedback, ignoring disconfirming data to preserve a sense of agency. Consider examples. Gamblers throw dice themselves, prefer personal rituals, and interpret streaks as skill. Managers who micromanage attribute team success to oversight and punish failure as a lapse of will rather than noisy conditions. Investors confuse short-term wins with skill, increasing risk-taking. The net effect is overconfidence, misallocated effort, and poor learning. A revealing paradox follows. Perceived control lowers anxiety and increases persistence, yet it reduces calibration and adaptive change. To resolve the tension, separate domains into controllable and uncontrollable. Practical tactics. 1. Predefine which variables you can influence and which are outside your control. 2. Set short, falsifiable tests for interventions and record outcomes. 3. Use default policies and pre-commitment to limit needless action. 4. Solicit external base rate data and formal feedback loops. 5. Replace rituals with experiments. Perform an action only to test a prediction, not to feel better. Over time, this practice shifts behavior from illusion-driven activity to evidence-driven intervention. Act when tests show effect. Stop when they do not. And reserve comfort rituals for low-stakes moments. The comfort zone trap. Comfort optimizes current payoff by minimizing surprise, yet the same optimization quietly narrows the behaviors capable of producing future gains. The comfort zone is a reliable state. Routines reduce error, conserve energy, and produce predictable outcomes. Neurologically, predictable success elevates reward signals and downregulates exploratory drives. Behaviorally, repetition automates performance into habits that require less attention. Ecologically, this is efficient when environments are stable. The trap appears when the environment shifts or the marginal returns of routine decline. What once conserved resources now limits learning and adaptation. 3 mechanisms explain the trap. First, reward-driven narrowing. Repeated success strengthens the policies that produced it, biasing selection toward exploitation over exploration. Second, attentional narrowing. Familiar tasks demand less cognitive bandwidth, so novel signals are less likely to be sampled and learned. Third, reinforcement inertia. Intermittent rewards for routine make change costly in perceived terms, so the system resists adopting riskier alternatives. Evidence is practical. Skill plateaus in sports and music follow periods of highly repetitive practice. Innovation studies show organizations that prioritize short-term metrics underinvest in exploratory projects. Behavioral experiments link stable rewards to reduce curiosity and slower adaptation to new contingencies. A practical, low-risk method to escape the trap pairs small perturbations with protected space. Introduce bounded novelty. Micro-challenges that expand the hypothesis set without threatening core performance. Mix variable practice with brief, scheduled experiments. Protect exploratory time with safe failure budgets. Use prompts that force perspective shifts. Track small prediction errors and treat them as data, not threats. In short, comfort buys stability and taxes adaptability. To grow capacity, design tiny recurring opportunities to explore, record outcomes, and integrate what works. Over months, those small perturbations compound into greater resilience and capability. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The weakest performers often rate themselves highest because error hides both the cause and the competence to see it. Competence builds the tools to detect incompetence. Cognitive shortcuts and sparse feedback create the Dunning-Kruger pattern. Novices lack both domain skill and the meta-knowledge needed to evaluate performance. Without reliable benchmarks, small successes feel like mastery. Conversely, more skilled people recognize nuance and edge cases, so they rate themselves more cautiously. This is not merely arrogance or humility. It's a metacognitive gap. 4 mechanisms explain the effect. First, feedback scarcity. When outcomes are noisy or delayed, people infer competence from limited signals. Second, diagnostic blindness. Novices don't yet know which errors matter and therefore misjudge quality. Third, social reinforcement. Echo chambers and selective praise lock overestimates in place. Fourth, feedback avoidance. Admitting low skill threatens identity, so corrective data may be downplayed. Concrete examples clarify dynamics. In workplace reviews, vague praise fuels overconfidence. In learning, students who receive only grades but not targeted critique remain unaware of specific weaknesses. Laboratory studies show that calibration improves dramatically with immediate, item-level feedback and with training that teaches learners how experts judge performance. A revealing paradox follows. Confidence without calibration can motivate practice, but unchecked confidence blocks useful correction. Practical steps therefore split. Maintain motivational momentum while hardening feedback. Use micro-assessments with clear benchmarks. Solicit disconfirming evaluation from trusted peers. Adopt checklists that externalize standards. And practice error-spotting exercises that teach diagnostic cues. Promote a culture that normalizes low-stakes failure and fast correction. Over time, these habits turn opaque mistakes into learnable signals. Calibration becomes a skill. The better you get, the better you see where you still must improve. Decision fatigue. After many choices, people systematically prefer easier, default options, not because they're lazy, but because the brain economizes processing by shifting toward low-cost strategies. Every decision consumes attention and working memory bandwidth. The brain manages limited resources by using fast heuristics early, and as choices accumulate, it increasingly favors defaults, habits, or emotionally salient shortcuts. This pattern conserves metabolic and cognitive cost, but biases later judgments and erodes consistency. 3 linked mechanisms explain the effect. First, depletion signaling. Neuromodulatory systems reflect accumulated task demands, lowering the threshold for effortful control. Second, heuristic reliance. When control wanes, the mind substitutes rules of thumb and pre-learned responses. Third, default drift. With repeated decisions, the path of least resistance becomes the chosen path. Defaults, procrastination, and satisficing rise. Concrete examples show predictable consequences. Judges grant more lenient rulings after breaks. Shoppers buy impulsively near checkout after a long browse. Managers focus on simple metrics late in the day. Decision fatigue flattens quality and amplifies inequality when only some people can offload choices. Practical remediation is straightforward. Reduce unnecessary choices, automate predictable selections, and schedule high-stakes decisions when control is fresh. Techniques: set defaults and pre-commit. Meal plans, email rules. Batch low-value choices. Allocate decision windows for complex tasks. Use checklists to externalize criteria. And insert short restorative breaks. Brief walks, hydration, or a structured micro-respite. Track outcomes to ensure defaults remain effective and adjust periodically. The spotlight effect. People entering a room overestimate how much others notice them, often by a factor of 3, because internal salience is mistaken for public spotlight. The spotlight effect describes our tendency to assume private features, mistakes, or feelings are obvious to observers. Psychologically, it springs from egocentric access. You have privileged, high-fidelity signals about yourself, your thoughts, discomforts, and attention that you project outward. Evolution favored social monitoring, so assuming others notice you can be adaptive in small doses, but it systematically inflates perceived visibility. 3 mechanisms produce the effect. First, anchoring on self-generated cues. Sensations and attention stick as reference points that the mind assumes are shared. Second, perspective-taking limits. Humans simulate others' views imperfectly and default to their own vantage. Third, memory weighting. Recent mishaps occupy working memory and seem more frequent and salient than they are for outside observers. Evidence and examples are straightforward. Studies show people expect strangers to recall an embarrassing t-shirt far more than strangers actually do. In social settings, silence or a stumble feels huge to the performer, but becomes a brief blip for listeners. The spotlight distorts feedback loops. Fearing excessive notice leads to self-monitoring, which can reduce spontaneity and increase perceived awkwardness. A useful paradox emerges. Overestimating visibility can both motivate prosocial preparation and amplify anxiety without improving outcomes. Practical tactics follow. Externalize reality. Ask for direct feedback rather than guessing. Run quick exposure experiments. Wear the odd shirt and test reactions. Practice perspective shifting. Deliberately imagine the event from several strangers' vantage points. And build a habit of time sampling. Note how long others actually dwell on an incident. Small tests reveal that attention moves on fast. In short, the spotlight effect is a bias of projection. Reduce its grip by replacing assumptions with measurements. Test, ask, and recalibrate, and your social world will feel less glaring and more manageable today. The hedonic treadmill. Getting more doesn't raise lasting happiness because the mind updates its reference points faster than our gains accumulate. The hedonic treadmill describes how positive changes, new income, relationships, or achievements initially boost well-being, but then fade as expectations and attention shift. This is not simple forgetfulness. Psychologically, the mind recalibrates what counts as normal and reallocates attention to what's missing next. Neurologically, reward systems respond strongly to novelty but habituate with repeated exposure, lowering the signal for once exciting outcomes. 3 mechanisms explain the treadmill's momentum. First, attentional migration. After an improvement, attention drifts toward remaining deficiencies or new possibilities, so satisfaction is transient. Second, reference recalibration. People reset their baseline by comparing current circumstances to updated standards, making yesterday's win today's norm. Third, goal escalation. Achieving a target often generates a larger or different target, creating an implicit velocity of desire that outpaces contentment. Empirical findings highlight these processes. Longitudinal studies show income correlates with life satisfaction up to a point, after which adaptation occurs. Relationship research finds enthusiasm fades as partners become familiar. Neural imaging shows diminishing dopaminergic responses with repeated rewards. A revealing paradox follows. Striving for improvement fuels competence and material benefit, but also accelerates recalibration, so upward mobility can make contentment feel perpetually out of reach. Practical strategies therefore focus on changing the adaptation dynamics rather than fighting desire. Slow novelty. Rotate experiences instead of intensifying them. Practice savoring. Explicitly attend to positive moments to prolong their signal. Anchor gratitude with concrete records to prevent rapid baseline shifts. Convert gains into experience rituals rather than mere possessions. Finally, set process goals, daily practice, relationship routines, rather than only outcome goals. Processes produce sustained pleasure because they create repeated, varied signals, less prone to rapid habituation. Over months, these small habits alter the rate at which your reference point moves, slowing the treadmill and making actual increases in well-being more durable. Anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression are not only states of feeling, they are different ways the brain responds when uncertainty, or expected cost overwhelms its predictive models. Evolution wired systems to flag danger and to conserve resources. Anxiety amplifies threat prediction and readiness. Depression downgrades expected reward and narrows behavioral scope to reduce costly exploration. In ancestral environments, these calibrations could protect survival, avoid predators, or conserve energy during scarcity. In modern contexts, chronic stress, social complexity, and persistent ambiguity miscalibrate those signals, turning adaptive alarms into disabling patterns. 4 mechanisms explain how normal regulation becomes disorder. First, threat amplification. Hyperactive salience networks increase vigilance and false positives, making harmless cues seem dangerous. Second, value downregulation. Reduced reward sensitivity flattens motivation, so actions no longer produce expected reinforcement. Third, behavioral narrowing. Avoidance and withdrawal reduce new data that could correct miscalibration, creating a feedback loop. Fourth, interference with learning. Heightened arousal or low engagement impairs consolidation and model updating, so maladaptive patterns persist. Empirical evidence supports this architecture. Neuroimaging links amygdala hyperreactivity with anxiety and blunted ventral striatal responses with depression. Longitudinal studies show chronic stress predicts later mood disorders. Behavioral experiments demonstrate how avoidance prevents disconfirmation of fearful beliefs. A practical paradox follows. The same systems that protected us can trap us. Effective responses therefore aim to recalibrate signals. Combine low-risk behavioral tests, graded exposure activity scheduling, with predictable feedback, habit tracking, external rewards, and social calibration, trusted observers, structured support. Optimize sleep, brief movement, and nutrient timing to restore neurochemical dynamics that support learning. When necessary, clinical interventions, CBT, medication, or guided behavioral experiments speed recalibration. Trauma and healing. Trauma often does not live primarily in stories but in shifted body predictions. Physiology learns danger before the mind learns a label. Traumatic events tune threat systems. The body speeds, attention narrows, and memories fragment so that sensations, not narrative, cue alarm. This calibration was adaptive for immediate survival, but becomes maladaptive when danger ends. The result? Flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance, and social withdrawal. Neurobiology links these features to heightened amygdala reactivity, altered hippocampal context encoding, and disrupted prefrontal regulation. Behaviorally, they produce patterns that prevent corrective feedback. Healing is therefore a multi-channel repair process. First, stabilization. Restore safety through routines, sleep, and simple somatic practices, breath regulation, paced movement, that downshift arousal. Second, tethering. Rebuild social scaffolds. Trusted witnesses who provide consistent, corrective evidence that the world is not uniformly threatening. Third, narrative integration. Under safe conditions, gradually link fragmented sensations to context and meaning, often with guided therapeutic frameworks that avoid re-traumatization. Fourth, targeted relearning. Graded exposure and reconsolidation techniques update threat predictions by pairing previously frightening cues with new, non-threatening outcomes. Concrete examples clarify the sequence. A survivor may first use grounding and sleep hygiene to reduce nightly hyperarousal, then practice short, supported exposures, walk past a location briefly, while tracking data, and later work with a therapist to name and contextualize memories. Social signals. Consistent, calm responses from peers accelerate relearning. Practical, low-friction steps. Prioritize sleep and regular movement. Schedule 2 brief grounding practices daily. Create a small list of trusted people to contact. Run micro-experiments that test safety. 10-minute exposures with clear exit rules. And keep simple behavioral records to show progress. Professional help, trauma-informed therapy or medical support magnifies these effects when needed. The philosophy of mind. The hard problem of consciousness. There is a precise puzzle. Neural activity explains behavior and reportability, yet it does not, by itself, explain why those processes are accompanied by what it's like, the subjective quality that makes experience distinct. The hard problem names an explanatory gap. Philosophers point to 2 contrasts: objective descriptions versus subjective appearances. Scientists map correlations between brain states and reported experience. Progress narrows empirical territory, but leaves a core question. Why does a functioning predictive, integrative system generate qualitative feelings rather than only symbol manipulation? 3 interconnected observations clarify the issue. First, empirical constraints. Dissociations such as blindsight and anesthesia show that behavioral competence can exist without conscious report, revealing functional conditions necessary for experience. Second, explanatory mismatch. Standard causal descriptions use categories, neurons, spikes, networks, that do not naturally translate into phenomenology. The gap may reflect a category error rather than a missing fact. Third, methodological leverage. Productive work treats consciousness as a target property with measurable functional signatures. Global ignition, recurrent processing, and integrated information are proposals that create testable bridges. Concrete examples help. In blindsight, sensory processing without integrated broadcasting yields behavior without felt experience. Anesthesia disrupts network-level integration and eliminates reportable consciousness. Trained meditators alter phenomenology while producing identifiable neural shifts. These cases show where mechanisms and reports diverge and where bridging hypotheses can be falsified. The practical posture is twofold. Keep pressing empirical bridges, precise functional markers that predict subjective reports, and practice conceptual pluralism, seeking transformations that relate third-person descriptions to first-person predicates. Accepting a provisional plural toolkit, mechanistic mapping, plus phenomenological taxonomy, advances science without prematurely declaring a final metaphysical solution. Dualism versus materialism. A precise paradox. Our best physical descriptions predict behavior and neural correlates, yet they leave open whether subjective experience is just those processes or something over and above them. Dualism and materialism offer opposing answers. Dualism posits that mental phenomena are fundamentally distinct from physical processes. Materialism holds that mental states are physical or fully realized by them. Historically, dualism conserved the intuition that qualia and agency resist reduction. Materialism pursued unity and empirical tractability. The contemporary debate matters because it shapes research priorities, clinical reasoning, and ethical claims. Start with constrained comparisons. Materialist programs, reductive, identity, functional, or emergent, explain mental capacities in terms of neural organization, information processing, or system-level dynamics. They generate testable hypotheses, correlate injury with loss of capacities, manipulate circuits, and observe predictable changes, or build functional analogues in machines. Dualist positions emphasize an explanatory gap. Why does activity feel like anything? Some dualists propose interactionist accounts or non-physical properties. Others reframe the problem as a metaphysical caution. Concrete cases clarify stakes. When a stroke abolishes speech and subjective report, materialism straightforwardly links tissue loss to loss of function. Dualism must explain how non-physical aspects are severed. Placebo effects and psychotherapy show how physical and psychological interventions both alter brain states and reported experience, favoring models that bridge levels. Artificial systems that mimic behavior prompt questions about whether functional equivalence suffices for experience. A productive middle path is methodological. Adopt ontological parsimony for practice, use physical models where they work, while keeping conceptual humility about ultimate metaphysics. Prioritize research that maps mechanisms, predicts interventions, and refines phenomenological categories. The debate remains philosophically deep, but need not paralyze empirical progress or ethical care. The self as an illusion, neurological cases, split brain patients, and dissociative phenomena show that what feels like one continuous self can fragment, which implies unity is constructed from multiple systems rather than handed to us intact. Start with context. Evolution favored predictable agents. A unified self simplifies social coordination and internal planning. But the brain is a collection of specialized processes, perception, memory, valuation, motor control, that each contributes different outputs. The sense of I emerges when these outputs are stitched into a coherent narrative and reinforced by social feedback. Three mechanisms produce the illusion. First, predictive binding. The brain integrates multimodal signals across time, creating a running model that reads as a single perspective. Second, narrative compression. Episodic traces are summarized into concise stories that explain actions and motives, giving continuity to disparate events. Third, social mirroring. Caregivers and peers name and repeat traits, stabilizing identity through external validation. Concrete examples clarify this architecture. In split brain research, separated hemispheres can endorse incompatible choices, revealing multiple controllers. In ordinary life, memory gaps or changing roles expose how stories reshape who we are. Developmental studies show toddlers form identity through labeling and repeated social responses. Adults revise identity by rehearsing new roles and receiving confirming responses. A revealing paradox follows. The self's constructed nature makes it both fragile and supple. Fragile because disrupted integration can produce distress. Supple because deliberately altering routines, labels, and social signals rewires what counts as me. Practical implication: change identity through 3 low-friction steps. Practice small, repeatable behaviors that instantiate a new trait. Label those acts to form a narrative. Seek consistent social responses that reinforce the change. Free will versus determinism. Our decisions arise from causal histories, yet the subjective sense of agency is the mechanism that coordinates planning, social accountability, and learning. So even if free will is illusory, the illusion is functionally indispensable. Philosophically, free will versus determinism frames whether actions are ultimately caused by prior states or include uncaused choices. Neuroscience highlights causal precursors, readiness potentials, and predictive processes, while also showing that reflection and delayed action change outcomes. The result is a tension: causal completeness on one hand and lived agency on the other. 3 linked observations clarify practical stakes. First, causal chains explain mechanisms, genes, development, and environment shape tendencies that bias choices. Second, metacognitive monitoring supplies the felt experience of control and the capacity to veto or revise impulses. This capacity supports deliberation and learning even if it operates within causal constraints. Third, institutions, laws, norms, and feedback systems amplify agency by creating predictable contingencies that make deliberate planning effective. Concrete examples help. Pre-commitment devices, timed transfers, account locks work whether or not choices are metaphysically free because they change input conditions and consequent behavior. In courts, assigning responsibility is less about metaphysics than about deterrence, rehabilitation, and social repair. Education and policy that strengthen deliberative opportunity, improve feedback, and reduce coercive constraints make it easier for agents to act in ways we value. A revealing practical synthesis follows. Debate about ultimate freedom need not paralyze policy. Treat agency as a functional property to be supported. Design environments that increase transparency, feedback, and opportunity for reflection. Encourage pre-commitment, clear incentives, and restorative systems that assume people can learn and adapt. The nature of thought. Thought is less like a single lantern and more like a workshop. It is a rapid, iterative recombination of stored patterns into provisional solutions. Context matters. The brain stores many practice routines, perceptual templates, motor sequences, linguistic chunks, and it runs lightweight simulations that splice those pieces together. Evolution favored speed and reuse. Building new answers from cached parts is cheaper than computing from first principles. Cognitive science frames thought as retrieval plus transformation. Memory supplies components. Executive processes select and recombine, and attention evaluates outputs. Three mechanisms explain how thinking unfolds. First, pattern retrieval provides rich building blocks, analogies, schemas, and motor scripts that give immediate structure. Second, compositional recombination stitches blocks into novel arrangements, enabling analogy, planning, and problem solving. Third, metacognitive evaluation iterates rapidly. Inner speech, mental imagery, and quick tests prune weak assemblies and guide further recombination. Concrete examples illuminate the workshop. A chess player scans familiar patterns, recombines moves into candidate lines, and mentally tests outcomes. A poet blends metaphors from different domains until phrasing coheres. A garage mechanic imagines a sequence of motions before touching tools. In each case, thought is economical. It recycles, recombines, and simulates just enough to act. A revealing paradox follows. Thought feels seamless and unitary, yet it is a succession of discrete, testable constructions. That discreteness is an advantage. Errors are local, updates fast, but it also explains why thinking can feel effortful when components are weak or poorly organized. Practical implication: improve thinking by improving parts and the workshop. Build richer pattern libraries through varied practice. Externalize assemblies with notes or sketches to reduce memory load. And use quick, falsifiable tests to prune bad recombinations. Practice analogical transfer to strengthen recombination skills. Over time, better parts and faster recombination yield clearer, more reliable thought. Small experiments accelerate learning by revealing what assembly choices work. The role of introspection. Introspection is informative but fallible. We can report many mental states accurately, yet we routinely confabulate reasons and miss unconscious drivers. Introspection means turning attention inward to report thoughts, feelings, and motives. It provides crucial data for self-regulation, moral responsibility, and therapy. yet it operates on limited inputs. Sensory and mnemonic traces available to conscious awareness are only a subset of the processes that shape behavior. Cognitive science and neuroscience show that introspective access depends on which representations are broadcast into higher-order systems, and that reports can be reconstructed after the fact. 3 mechanisms explain why introspection both helps and misleads. First, access limitation. Only some neural representations reach the workspace available for verbal report. Many fast procedural signals never enter awareness. Second, post hoc construction. When asked why we acted, the mind often assembles plausible narratives from memory and cues, rather than retrieving a verbatim internal log, producing confident but inaccurate explanations. Third, metacognitive monitoring. We possess capacities to evaluate our own confidence and error rates. These can be trained and used to flag unreliable introspections. Concrete examples clarify practical use. In therapy, naming emotions and mapping triggers improves regulation because labels recruit descriptive and regulatory networks. In decision contexts, asking for predicted outcomes before choosing reduces post hoc rationalization. Laboratory work shows people misattribute mood sources, weather versus interpersonal cause, unless prompted to consider alternatives. A revealing paradox follows. Introspection is essential for insight, yet simultaneously a source of error. Make it more reliable by structuring the process. Time-box introspection, collect external data, note confidence, and test hypotheses with small experiments. Practice labeling sensations precisely. Keep brief observational notes and seek disconfirming evidence. Over time, pairing measured introspective reports with behavioral tests sharpens self-knowledge and reduces costly confabulation. Moral emotions and empathy, a precise fact. Observing another person's distress activates overlapping neural and autonomic responses with our own pain circuits, showing empathy is rooted in shared physiological processing rather than mere intellectual sympathy. Moral emotions, shame, guilt, indignation, compassion, function as information channels. They compress social facts into actionable signals. Guilt flags likely harm done by oneself. Shame signals social standing threats. Indignation highlights norm violations, and compassion points to opportunities for repair. Evolution favored such signals because they coordinate reciprocal behavior and enforce cooperation where reputation mattered. 4 mechanisms explain how these emotions shape moral behavior. First, affect as signal. Visceral responses provide rapid priorities that guide attention and choice. Second, perspective taking. Cognitive empathy simulates other states, adding granularity to raw affect and informing appropriate responses. Third, social enforcement. Indignation and shame operate as decentralized policing tools, broadcasting norms and deterring violation. Fourth, learning and calibration. Moral emotions update through feedback, praise, sanction, and observed outcomes, so norms evolve within groups. Concrete examples anchor the account. In small-scale societies, public shaming and ritual apology maintain cooperation by making deviations costly. In modern organizations, structured feedback and visible accountability systems channel moral emotions toward corrective action rather than escalation. Laboratory work links empathic concern with helping behavior, and longitudinal studies show moral emotions predict long-term cooperation better than abstract moral reasoning alone. A revealing tension arises. The same mechanisms that enable social cohesion can also produce out-group hostility when empathy is selectively deployed. Practical implications follow. Cultivate broader perspective taking to widen empathy's circle. Design institutions that translate moral signals into constructive feedback. Clear norms, predictable sanctions, and repair pathways. And train metacognitive checks to prevent moral emotions from hardening into reflexive condemnation. In short, moral emotions and empathy are proximate tools of social coordination, fast, noisy, and improvable. Use them deliberately, expand who you simulate, make norms explicit, and convert effective alerts into structured opportunities for repair. Ethics and the human condition. Ethics is the social software that scales cooperation. Moral rules change behavior faster than laws alone because they tap emotions, reputation, and routine. Human life sits between scarcity and abundance, individuality and interdependence. Ethics emerges to solve coordination problems. Who shares? Who sacrifices? Who punishes free riders? Evolution shaped proximate tools, empathy, guilt, indignation, that convert social facts into prioritized actions. Culture then refines and composes those tools into explicit norms and institutions that stabilize large-scale cooperation. 3 mechanisms explain ethical dynamics. First, norm formation, local practices that produce mutual benefits spread by social learning and become moralized when sanctions and reputational consequences attach. Second, moral emotion. Effective signals compress social information, prompting quick action and reinforcing memory. Compassion invites help. Indignation signals norm violation. Third, institutional scaffolding. Laws, markets, and rituals translate moral impulses into predictable incentives and corrective structures, so cooperation survives anonymity and scale. Concrete tensions are unavoidable. Norms solve coordination, but also exclude. Moral emotions bind groups, yet justify harshness toward outsiders. Institutions can institutionalize justice or entrench injustice. Historical examples, from communal sharing norms in small societies to bureaucratic rule systems in modern states, show shifts in ethical emphasis as scale and technology change. A practical stance follows. Treat ethics as design. First, make norms visible and enforceable with low-cost cues and feedback. Second, widen empathy circle through practices that increase contact and perspective taking. Third, institutionalize repair. Clear channels for accountability, restitution, and learning prevent moral fury from calcifying into cycles of harm. Finally, cultivate habits, small rituals, public commitments, and transparent decision rules that align private action with collective standards. Ethics is neither fixed nor purely subjective. It is a living technology for living together. Design norms and institutions consciously, test their effects, and iterate so moral life scales with human complexity. Meaning and the search for purpose. A precise finding. People who report a strong sense of purpose show measurably better health and longevity in longitudinal studies, showing that meaning is not just philosophy, but a predictor of measurable outcomes. Meaning lives at the intersection of enduring projects and the stories that justify them. Biologically, we respond to immediate rewards. Psychologically, we need extended reasons to invest effort over months and years. Purpose arises when short-term impulses are organized by narratives that point toward a future self, and when social systems recognize and reinforce that direction. 4 mechanisms explain durable meaning. First, commitment structures convert transient desire into sustained action. Deadlines, memberships, and public promises make continued effort likely. Second, narrative framing compresses messy experience into a coherent plot. Why you do something becomes a story you can retell to anchor motivation. Third, ritualization and micro-habits turn loftier aims into repeatable cues that produce steady progress. Fourth, social validation supplies external evidence. Recognition, role expectations, and reciprocal investment make a purpose socially plausible and personally sticky. Concrete examples clarify the logic. A teacher who frames daily grading as part of building future readers sustains effort better than one focused only on immediate payoff. Volunteers who share progress in groups keep showing up. Long-term research projects survive because methods, rituals, and peer norms preserve momentum across setbacks. A revealing paradox follows. Chasing meaning as a goal tends to undermine it. Meaning is best cultivated as a byproduct of repeated, socially embedded commitments. Practical steps. Choose modest, time-bounded projects you can repeat. Write a short narrative that links actions to a future self. Create 2 micro-rituals, start and closure for each day's work. And share progress with a small accountability circle. Over months, these low-friction practices convert discrete acts into a durable sense of purpose that supports well-being and sustained contribution. The aware universe. The most striking scientific fact is procedural. Every empirical claim depends on observers registering outcomes, which makes awareness an operational constraint on theories of the universe. The aware universe reframes a question. Do facts about consciousness merely supervene on physical processes? Or do they function as constraints that shape which physical descriptions are empirically adequate? In physics, measurement and information are not neutral. They determine which states are accessible and which predictions succeed. Awareness, treated as a capacity to register and report, therefore becomes part of the data set that any full account must accommodate. 3 linked observations clarify productive trajectories. First, observational constraint. Theories that ignore how information is gathered risk underspecifying which structures matter. Quantum measurement problems exemplify this. Observable outcomes depend on interactions that correlate systems with measuring apparatuses. Second, explanatory economy. Adding consciousness as an extra fundamental ingredient, strong panpsychism, risks multiplying ontological kinds unless it yields distinct, testable predictions. Minimalist routes treat informational and integrative criteria as empirically tractable proxies. Third, phenomenological data. Subjective report and altered states supply structured variations that can be mapped to neural and systemic signatures, offering controlled axes for comparison. Concrete approaches follow. Treat consciousness as a target property defined by functional markers, integrated information, global broadcasting, or predictive coherence, and test whether extending physical models to include those markers improves prediction. Compare systems, brains, engineered networks on those axes and look for divergences that require new principles. A revealing paradox emerges. Treating the universe as aware can either be a metaphysical flourish or a strict research heuristic. Practically, use awareness as a constraint. Design experiments where reportability and information flow are variables, and prefer hypotheses that increase empirical leverage. This keeps inquiry scientific while respecting that subjective data matters for a complete account of reality. The collective mind. The social brain. Humans don't store complete portraits of everyone they know. They store compressed role patterns, friend, rival, mentor, that let dozens of relationships be tracked with limited cognitive bandwidth. The social brain evolved to manage relationships because cooperation pays. Rather than memorize every trait of every person, neural systems compress repeated patterns into role-like templates and predictive rules. This compression allows rapid inference, what a neighbor will expect, whether a colleague will reciprocate, so decisions scale beyond what raw memory would allow. 4 mechanisms explain how social cognition achieves scale. First, compression. Category-like representations reduce complexity. Labels and stereotypes are imperfect but efficient indexes. Second, predictive modeling. The brain simulates likely reactions from a small set of inferred motives, saving time in fast social exchanges. Third, reputation signaling. Gossip, ritual, and public acknowledgement act as distributed memory, broadcasting compressed summaries that coordinate expectations. Fourth, institutional scaffolding. Norms, roles, and systems, markets, laws, teams, externalize social computations, so individuals rely less on private inference. Concrete examples make this practical. Small communities use gossip to replace exhaustive surveillance. Modern platforms codify reputations with ratings and visible histories. Teams use clear roles and rituals to minimize misunderstanding during high-pressure tasks. The trade-off is fidelity. Compression reduces nuance and can crystallize bias. Practical implication: improve social accuracy by widening your sample and making implicit patterns explicit. Seek disconfirming evidence about key people. Formalize expectations in teams, roles, checklists, public commitments, and design transparent reputation cues where trust matters. At the societal level, institutions that surface reliable information, clear records, impartial arbitration, reduce costly misprediction. In short, the social brain wins scale by compressing others into actionable patterns. Guard against error by exposing those patterns to testing, and by building external scaffolds that preserve nuance while keeping coordination tractable. Theory of mind. A single glance launches dozens of rapid mind models, predicting a stranger's next move, estimating their long-term preferences, and slotting them into cultural roles. Theory of mind is the set of tools that builds those models. Context helps. From infancy, humans begin attributing unseen mental states, desires, beliefs, intentions, and by around age, 4 children pass false belief tasks that mark explicit perspective taking. Neuroscience locates key operations in networks that simulate others' viewpoints and compare predictions with outcomes. Evolution favored these systems because anticipating others' behavior improves cooperation, deception detection, and coordination. 3 mechanisms explain how theory of mind runs in practice. First, simulation. We reuse our own decision models to imagine what another person would do in the same situation. Second, hierarchical reasoning. We compute first-order beliefs, she wants X, then second-order beliefs, she thinks I want Y, enabling negotiation and strategy. Third, calibration through feedback. Social responses update our models. Repeated interaction refines templates into reliable predictions. Examples show both power and limits. In conversation, small cues, eye contact, timing, signal immediate intent. In politics, narratives and identity predict longer-term positions. Errors are systematic. Projection leads to the spotlight effect and curse of knowledge. Limited samples produce stereotyping. Second-order mistakes create tragic miscoordination when parties misread motives. A revealing paradox follows. Accurate social prediction requires both imaginative simulation and disciplined testing, yet everyday interaction privileges speed over verification. Practical steps reduce error. Slow down to test an assumption. Ask one clarifying question before acting. Treat confident judgments as provisional. And collect behavioral evidence rather than relying on plausible stories. In groups, create shared norms and transparent signals to reduce costly inference. Theory of mind is not mystical insight. It is a layered competence we can sharpen by deliberate practice, structured feedback, and clearer communication. Practicing these habits improves social outcomes over time. Conformity and obedience. In classic laboratory studies, roughly 1/3 of participants followed orders to administer what they believed were harmful shocks to another person, showing how authority cues can override personal judgment. Conformity and obedience are complementary social solutions. Conformity aligns individuals to local norms, so coordination is swift. Obedience aligns action to hierarchical commands, so complex tasks scale. Begin with mechanisms. Social proof and normative pressure make people adopt majority behaviors to gain approval and reduce risk. Authority heuristics trigger deference when a source appears credentialed. Situational cues, uniforms, institutional settings, time pressure, amplify both tendencies. Cognitive load and ambiguity increase reliance on social signals, while diffusion of responsibility reduces perceived personal culpability. Empirical examples clarify the dynamics. Ash's line experiments show private disagreement yields public conformity under majority pressure. Milgram's obedience studies reveal how incremental requests and an experimenter's presence shifts responsibility outward. Field observations add nuance. Workplace cultures, militaries, and bureaucracies harness obedience for efficiency, but can perpetuate harmful practices when checks are absent. A revealing paradox follows. The same mechanisms that make groups functional also enable error and wrongdoing. Conformity stabilizes norms, but can fossilize bad practices. Obedience secures coordination, but can erode moral responsibility. Practical implications focus on institutional design and personal habits. Build checks, independent audits, rotating leadership, and clear reporting channels. Normalize constructive dissent with devil's advocate roles and anonymous feedback. Train people to recognize authority cues and use accountability scripts. Name the decision, state the authority claim, request verification. Create brief pauses at critical junctions to surface alternatives. In daily life, practice 2 habits. Ask, what would an outside observer see? And invite one disconfirming perspective before major choices. Small, repeatable checks preserve coordination while reducing the risk of harmful conformity and blind obedience. Design systems that encourage thoughtful dissent. Tribalism and group identity. A single arbitrary label can generate preferential treatment for us within minutes, showing that tribalism is a fast social heuristic, not a slow moral choice. Tribalism begins as a cognitive shortcut. Facing complex social environments, humans compress information into categories: friend or foe, ally or outsider, so decisions require less evidence and less time. Evolution favored this because quick alignment with a group improved coordination and survival. Modern life, however, multiplies group labels and lowers their cost, turning an adaptive shortcut into a social lens that distorts judgment. 4 mechanisms explain how tribalism operates and escalates. First, social categorization creates in-group bias. Once labeled, people overweight positive evidence for insiders and negative evidence for outsiders. Second, signaling and ritual bind members, making loyalty visible and costly to fake. Third, norm enforcement and moralization, convert practical cooperation into moral duty, punishing deviation and amplifying cohesion. Fourth, identity fusion makes group membership part of self-concept, so threats to the group feel like threats to the individual and justify extreme defense. Concrete examples make the dynamics clear. Sports rivalries harmlessly channel identity. Political media ecosystems turn policy disagreement into moral warfare. Corporations can create helpful loyalty that, unchecked, suppresses whistleblowing. Online platforms amplify selection and signal intensity, accelerating polarization. A revealing paradox follows. Tribal structures enable trust and large-scale cooperation, yet they also magnify conflict when boundaries align with resource or status competition. Practical responses therefore aim to preserve coordination while reducing destructive alignment. Design interventions. Create cross-cutting identities, project teams, mixed interest groups. Make norms explicit and incentivize disconfirming evidence. Institutionalize transparent feedback and accountability. And cultivate routine perspective-taking exercises that reveal overlapping interests. In daily practice, limit single-axis identities, rotate roles, seek 3 disconfirming sources before endorsing a claim, and build low-cost rituals that connect across groups. Small structural changes redirect the benefits of tribalism toward resilience rather than rivalry. The psychology of influence. People often change behavior more in response to perceived consensus than to persuasive facts. Social cues shortcut deliberation because they compress complex trust into simple signals. Influence exploits heuristics. Evolution and culture favor shortcuts that let us infer reliability quickly. If many people do X, or a credible source endorses Y, acceptance is a low-cost bet. Psychology identifies reliable levers: social proof, follow the majority; reciprocity, return favors; authority, defer to experts; scarcity, value, limited items; commitment/consistency, honor prior statements; and liking, comply with those we like. These operate without deep reasoning, making influence fast and scalable. Mechanisms interact. Social proof and authority convert ambiguity into action. Commitment converts small initial acts into larger behaviors. Scarcity raises perceived urgency and reduces testing. Experimental classics and fieldwork, Ash's conformity studies, Milgram's obedience paradigms, and Cialdini's applied research show these levers reliably move groups even when arguments would not. A revealing paradox follows. Efficient cues increase coordination and trust, but also enable manipulation. The same shortcut that helps you choose a vaccine in a fast-moving outbreak can be exploited to sell worthless products or polarize publics. Practical, ethical guidance splits into 2 tracks. To influence responsibly, make cues truthful, test interventions, obtain informed consent, and prioritize reversible nudges. To resist undue influence, slow decisions, check base rates, require external verification for urgent claims, and expose hidden incentives. Use commitment carefully, pre-commit to principles rather than to outcomes, and diversify trusted sources. In short, the psychology of influence trades argumentative depth for signal speed. Design and consume influence deliberately. Use honest cues to guide action and build simple defenses, delay, verification, and diverse sampling to keep autonomy intact. Mass behavior and collective emotion. Groups often feel louder than the sum of their members. When emotion spreads through a network, it amplifies signal, shortens deliberation, and converts private unease into public action. Collective emotion is not simply many people feeling the same thing. It's a process where affect functions as fast information. A shout, image, or metric triggers neighbors, who react in turn. The structure of the network, tight clusters, influential hubs, and bridging ties, determines whether that initial spark becomes a local ripple or a global wave. Media and institutions then translate that wave into material effects by coordinating resources, changing incentives, or signaling legitimacy. 4 mechanisms explain predictable dynamics. First, emotional contagion. Mirrored expressions and rapid sharing move effect before facts are processed. Second, threshold signaling. Individuals act when perceived participation crosses personal thresholds, producing sudden cascades. Third, feedback amplification. Visible reactions, trends, headlines validate and accelerate the emotion. Fourth, institutional coupling. Markets, platforms, and organizations convert collective feeling into tangible outcomes. Purchases, protests, policy shifts. Concrete examples are familiar. Panic buying arises when visible scarcity signals meet low thresholds. Viral outrage can topple reputations when hubs amplify accusations. Coordinated enthusiasm propels crowdfunding and cultural hits. The risk is systematic error, false alarms, mob punishment, and erosion of deliberative norms. Practical response emphasizes measurement and calibrated friction. Monitor multiple signals, behavioral metrics, not just sentiment. Create predictable delays for high-impact actions. Diversify trusted messengers to reduce hub-driven spikes, and design low-cost verification steps before mass coordination. Public timelines, transparent criteria. Institutions should expose incentives and enable graceful reversals to prevent escalation. In short, collective emotion is an informational amplifier, powerful and efficient for coordination, but prone to runaway error. Design systems that surface reliable data, add modest buffers, and preserve avenues for correction, so public feeling can guide action without hijacking it. Culture as a mirror of mind. Culture mirrors mind by externalizing recurring mental operations into public patterns that individuals can reuse. Human minds face limits, finite attention, fallible memory, and variable experience. Culture compresses these limits into shared artifacts, myths, rituals, tools, stories that encode heuristics for interpreting the world. In that sense, culture is a toolbox built from repeated mental successes. Its forms are not arbitrary ornaments, but distilled solutions. Calendars solve seasonal prediction. Etiquette reduces social friction. Jokes mark shared categories. 3 mechanisms explain the mirror function. First, externalization. Minds offload cognitive work into public symbols and routines, so complex tasks survive across individuals and generations. Second, stabilization. Repeated practice and social reinforcement turn provisional techniques into stable traditions that newcomers adopt without re-deriving them. Third, amplification. Institutions and media scale local solutions into widespread norms that feed back into mental habits, reshaping attention and expectation. Evidence appears in cross-cultural regularities and cultural evolution studies. Certain moral motifs and kinship rules recur because they solve predictable coordination problems. Technological innovations spread when they reduce cognitive or material cost. Everyday examples make the idea concrete. A recipe encodes timing and ratios so a novice can reproduce a dish. A ceremonial greeting coordinates status cues so interactions proceed without costly negotiation. A revealing paradox follows. Culture preserves successful mental shortcuts, but also ossifies biases. The practical takeaway is design-minded stewardship. Treat cultural forms as tools to be evaluated. When a tradition impairs learning or excludes, adjust its signals and incentives. When a practice promotes shared understanding, promote transmission through clear cues and reproducible steps. Curate cultural tools, deliberately sow public life supplies, clearer mental models for collective flourishing and resilience. Memes and shared myths. A single catchy image or phrase can rewire group behavior faster than a long argument because memes compress meaning into signals that travel with low cognitive cost. Memes and shared myths are cultural replicators, units of information, stories, symbols, rituals that propagate because they solve coordination, signal identity, or structure attention. They survive when transmission is easy, mimetic fidelity, when they resonate with pre-existing biases, and when they scaffold social practices that reproduce them. Think of them as cultural algorithms, compact instructions that run on human minds and social networks. 3 mechanisms explain their power. First, fidelity. Memes that are simple, repeatable, and memorable copy well across people and media. Second, resonance. A meme that maps onto emotional or cognitive priors, fear of loss, humor, status, gets amplified. Third, scaffolding. Memes that attach to rituals, institutions, or incentives become self-maintaining because practice and payoff keep them active beyond novelty. Concrete cases make this visible. Urban legends spread because they match storytelling templates and trigger caution. Brand slogans become shared myths when repeated in rituals of consumption. Political myths consolidate support when they align with identity cues and institutional reinforcement. Internet culture accelerates selection. Rapid replication favors sharp, emotionally charged content, sometimes at the cost of nuance. A revealing paradox follows. Memes increase coordination, but also crystallize error. A useful myth simplifies decision-making, but can ossify into dogma. Practical implication. Curate memes deliberately. Favor templates that encourage testing, askable claims, transparent sources. Attach myths to constructive rituals, deliberate debate routines, civic practices, and reduce transmission of brittle formats, anonymous outrage, unchecked virality. Teach media literacy that emphasizes source checking and motive mapping. In short, memes are powerful cultural tools, efficient for coordination, yet dangerous when left unexamined. Shape the formats and incentives that select for accuracy and repair, not just for spread. Technology and the global brain. Digital networks have turned isolated judgments into coordinated action. Today, a small set of platforms route billions of attention decisions daily, effectively wiring human minds into a single, distributed problem solver and amplifier. The global brain is not metaphor alone. It describes how technology provides the infrastructure for minds to share memory, test hypotheses, and coordinate at planetary scale. Historically, institutions externalized cognition, libraries, markets, and courts. Modern tech accelerates this. Databases become extended memory, algorithms become common heuristics, and low-latency messaging makes rapid coordination possible. 4 core mechanisms drive the effect. First, attention markets allocate scarce cognitive bandwidth. What we see and think about is shaped by ranking algorithms and economic incentives. Second, shared memory. Search, archives, and collaborative platforms lets many minds access the same representations and iterate on them. Third, low-latency feedback closes loops. Rapid signals amplify successful patterns and suppress others, sometimes before deliberation can intervene. Fourth, governance scaffolds determine which patterns are allowed to scale. Protocols, moderation, and economic rules shape emergent behavior. Concrete examples show trade-offs. Collective projects like open-source software and collaborative knowledge bases solve problems beyond single experts. Conversely, virality can spread error and polarize attention when signaling overrides verification. The same low-latency loops that enable emergency coordination can also produce attention cascades that outpace correction. Design implications are direct. Build modular, transparent attention architectures. Diversify hubs to avoid single points of failure. Embed verification steps into common feedback loops. And create slow path channels for high-risk decisions. Institutionalize visible incentives so the global brain's gains are reproduced, not exploited. In short, technology makes a global mind possible, powerful, fragile, and design-dependent. Treat the global brain as an engineered ecology, tune its incentives, expose its signals, and protect its diversity so collective intelligence grows resilient rather than runaway. The future of human consciousness. We already alter consciousness deliberately. Deep brain stimulation, psychedelics, and brain-computer interfaces change experience. And that means the future of consciousness will be an engineered, socially regulated landscape, not an inevitable revelation. Consciousness will change because inputs change. Tools that expand sensory bandwidth, mediate attention, or rewrite memory traces alter the data the brain uses to model the world. Augmentation comes in forms. Pharmacological tuning that shifts effective set points. Interfaces that feed external memory or perceptual streams into cortical processors. And social platforms that reweight what counts as salient. Each intervention reshapes the predictive models that generate subjective feeling. 4 dynamics will shape what emerges. First, affordance selection. Technologies privilege certain modes of experience, constant feed versus slow depth, and thereby favor minds adapted to those modes. Second, distributed embodiment. Networked cognition blurs boundaries. Extended memory, shared attention, and collaborative problem spaces create hybrid conscious systems. Third, evolutionary filtering. Social and economic incentives will select for attention architectures that succeed in existing marketplaces, not necessarily those that maximize flourishing. Fourth, governance and norming. Ethical frameworks, regulation, and shared practices will determine which augmentations become legitimate and how risks are mitigated. Concrete near-term examples. Restorative BC is that return speech to paralyzed patients will normalize neural interfaces. Attention economy designs that reward quick reactivity will increase shallow processing unless countermeasures exist. Sanctioned therapeutic uses of psychedelics may expand accepted models of meaning and emotion. A revealing paradox: expanding conscious capacity can both increase freedom and narrow form. To steer favorable outcomes, prioritize designs that preserve epistemic diversity, require transparent feedback loops, and embed reversible, low-risk pathways for experimentation. Invest in institutions that audit effects on autonomy and social cohesion. The future of consciousness will be partly a technological story and partly a civic one. What we choose to build and regulate will shape what it feels like to be human.